When Admiral Yamamoto learned that Admiral Tanaka had not delivered the supplies to Guadalcanal that night, he was furious again, and the fact that Tanaka had scored a major sea victory over the Americans did not help. Yamamoto knew better than any other Japanese commander that the Americans had an enormous capability to construct ships, and it was already showing in the battle for Guadalcanal. Time, as he saw, was not on his side, and every day's failure to deliver the supplies meant more wastage of the troops. Sent calving on the island, Tanaka reasoned that night that many American destroyers were still unhurt without weapons himself. He had no desire to run the gauntlet. Only later did he realize that the Americans were thoroughly disorganized, that most of the destroyers were engaged in rescue operations, and that if he had gone back to deliver the supplies, he probably would have been successful and could have steamed away without another fight. Admiral Yamamoto's displeasure was quickly felt. Admiral Tanaka had tried hard, and would try again to carry out a mission that at best was improbable, the small-scale and piecemeal resupply of a large fighting force trapped on an island with the enemy in control of the air and the sea. By day on December 1st, Admiral Tanaka was back at Shortland, and in the next 2 days the destroyers Arashi and Noaki and Yugur were assigned by Admiral Yamamoto to join the supply fleet on December 3rd in his flagship Naganami. Accompanied by 10 destroyers, he sailed again. 7 of the destroyers were loaded with supplies, and the other 3 were the escort. In the morning the ships sighted a group of B-7s, but the planes were obviously bent on other business, for they did not attack late in the afternoon, as the Japanese force was steaming under air protection from 120 float planes from Bun. A group of American fighters, bombers and torpedo bombers attacked each side, lost several aircraft, and the destroyer Aiken Army was damaged by a near miss from a bomb. Several men were killed and wounded, but the ship's capacity was not seriously impaired, and the relief force steamed on the American pilots returned to Henderson Field to report that they had put 2 1,000-pound bombs into one ship, one into another, and that 2 other destroyers had been hit by United States torpedoes. It was a wildly optimistic evaluation of the real performance, and when Admiral Tanaka reached Savu Island, he turned the ships to the Guadalcanal coast, and at midnight the 7 supply destroyers began dumping their drums overboard. They had time to take to small boats, haul the rope ends into shore, return to the destroyer's hoist, the boats, and pull away. The only opposition that night came from several PT boats, which were kept away by the 3 escort destroyers, as the supply ships did their job. The supply mission, however, was not a success through no fault of Admiral Tanaka, but because of the aggressiveness of General Vandergrift's troops ashore, and the weakness of the Japanese troops. The Americans were patrolling and engaging the Japanese constantly, and effectively prevented a large force from reaching the shore the next day. To retrieve most of the drums, the men who did come were too exhausted to pull in many drums. Only 300 of the 1,500 came into Japanese hands. The rest washed out to sea or were sunk by the machine gun fire of Cactus Air Force planes the next day back in Buin on December 4th. Admiral Tanaka made preparations for the next run. That evening Admiral Mawa arrived at Buin in his flagship, and Admiral Tanaka was ordered to report on the Battle of November 30th and the supply operations. Tanaka took this opportunity to unleash his true feelings, that the whole supply operation was an enormous waste of Japan's resources and could never succeed. The situation must grow worse, not better, as a consequence of the American build-up of power. He felt that the complete demoralization of the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal and of the fleet could be the only outcome. He recommended that the troops be evacuated immediately from Guadalcanal, and that the strong base wanted by the High Command be built at Shortland. This discussion was not at all what Maawa and Yamamoto wanted to hear. The Imperial General Staff had demanded the capture of Guadalcanal at all costs. Plans were being made in Tokyo to assign an entire army to the capture, but until they could be carried out, Yamamoto had to take responsibility for supply of the 15,000 men on Guadalcanal. Yamamoto's build-up of the supply force showed how vital he held the supply mission. In the next 3 days, Admiral Tanaka received 4 more destroyers, the Urui Taniki Araki and the spanking new 2,500-ton Teruzuki. She became Tanaka's flagship, and on December 7th, the Admiral under took his third drum supply run. This time he elected to send the ships up under a divisional commander, Captain Torajiro Sato. The Cactus Air Force was out in strength and attacked the supply group that night. Captain Sato reported that the American bombers had dropped a bomb that blew in the side of the destroyer Noaki. She had to be detached and sent back to Buen under tow of the Naganami, escorted by 2 other destroyers. When Admiral Tanaka received that message, he set out in his new flag ship for the scene, but before he could arrive, he had bad news. The destroyer team had approached Guadalcanal, harried by American planes all the way, and then had been subjected to a concentrated attack by American PT boats. This was the first time the PT boats were operating in a new fashion. They had the services that night of several float planes from the damaged cruisers, which had been left behind at Tulagi. The float planes found the Japanese supply destroyers and dropped flares, and the P-boats attacked firing torpedoes, moving in close, and strafing the Japanese destroyers. The harassment caused many casualties, and persuaded Captain Sato to turn around and go back to Bun without delivering his supplies. When Admiral Tanaka learned of the decision in mid-ocean, he concurred. The American pressure grew stronger every day. On December 8th, the destroyer group returned to Bun just in time for an air raid on the Shortland anchorage. By B-7S2 tankers were badly damaged, but the destroyers remained intact. Admiral Tanaka was ordered to mount his 4th attempt to resupply Guadalcanal, knowing that the troops there must be close to starvation, since they had not had effective supply for a month. Meanwhile, the Imperial General Staff had a new idea. Let the submarine force assist more in the resupply of Guadalcanal. A group of submarines, most of them of the 2,000-ton IBO class, were sent to Buen. They were loaded with supplies, and one by one were dispatched for Guadalcanal to land at Machino Point on the western end of the island. This entire operation, mounted under Rear Admiral Hisamito at Rabaul, was separate from Tanaka, the submariners who hated the duty, and were persuaded only by the revelation that the troops in Guadalcanal were reduced to eating grass, called it the mole operation. The first run made early in December was successful, and Lieutenant Commander Yachi Tanabe took the I-176 to Guadalcanal and unloaded the first supplies the troops had seen for days, but the second mission was not a success. On December 7th, the I-3 left Buen loaded with provisions. 2 nights later, P-59 attacked as she surfaced off Cape Esperance. The PT boat hit her with 2 torpedoes, and the submarine blew up, leaving only 1 IGN to swim ashore to Guadalcanal to report the submarine supply system continued, and by and large it was more successful than supply by destroyer. Most of the assigned submarines got through, but still the amount of supplies they could deliver constituted no more than a drop in the bucket for 15,000 survivors on Guadalcanal. On December 11th, Admiral Tanaka led the 4th supply mission himself. The ships were attacked from the air, but the planes were driven off, and 11 destroyers headed for Guadalcanal at midnight just south of Savu Island. They were attacked by a swarm of PT boats. 7 destroyers dropped 1,200 drums of supplies and began to withdraw. And the PT boats attacked 2 of them, managed to put torpedoes into the Teruzuki, and the ship caught fire and lost way. The fire reached a magazine, and the destroyer blew up, and Admiral Tanaka on the bridge was knocked unconscious when he came to. The ship was sinking, and the Naganami was alongside taking off survivors. He moved his flag to that vessel, but no sooner had he gone aboard than she and the Arashi both took off at high speed, leaving many survivors on the sinking ship because the PT boats were attacking again. The 2 destroyers dropped lifeboats as they went, and some survivors managed to get to Guadalcanal and the Japanese lines. And on December 12th, Admiral Tanaka returned to Bun. He learned that Admiral Yamamoto had finally decided that the cost of this method of resupply was too expensive and had suspended the destroyer runs to Guadalcanal. Tanaka was ordered to report to Rabaul and begin taking supplies and troops to build a base on New Georgia, whose position had become newly important in the failure of the 17th Army to mount the expected offensive at New Guinea, and to retake Guadalcanal. Admiral Tanaka did not know it, but his recommendation had been the basis for a decision by Admiral Yamamoto and the Imperial General Staff that Guadalcanal must be evacuated. The men spoke of fighting and victory, But as the days passed, the enormity of their situation came in upon them like a cloud. The PLS overhead bore white stars, not red suns, and the sounds of the artillery that pounded the mountains were not Japanese sounds, but the enemy, even though his presence was ever around them, was not the major factor in their lives. They could see in the eyes and lips of their officers the truth: they were abandoned on this island. Tsuji, better than most, knew how desperate their situation must be, and to purposely run shipground had never been heard of in Japan, and not one ship but six ships loaded with men and guns, tanks and trucks and rice and tinned food for half an army had been run ground, and so little of the food had been saved. Even the bags of rice that Tsuji and his fellow seamen had saved and landed aboard the trucks, Tokyo taxis they called them, were found to be half spoiled by the seawater. The rice Tsuji found was gone too soon. His group had not brought enough supplies to help the others. Instead, in less than a week they were eating into the slender supply of the pioneers, and in 3 weeks all the rice was gone, and they were foraging for food. Not many of them knew how at first, but they learned or they starved, and some learned and starved. The numbers of graves continued to increase, until Tsuji and the others weary as they began to build a shrine as they built. Many of the unit lay down and did not get up, and their headstones joined the circle around the clearing. Among those who would die were Petty Officer Tsuji and his friend. By this time the 15,000 troops on Guadalcanal were really beginning to succumb to starvation, and they were unable to mount any sort of offensive. Back on November the 30th, the day of the Battle of Tassafaronga, Carlson's Raider Battalion had ambushed 100 Japanese soldiers in a bivouac area on the south bank of the Longa River. They caught the Japanese with their rifles stacked and killed nearly all of them before they could recover from the surprise Mula, the 1,500 feet. Mountain that stood above Henderson Field was still in Japanese hands, as was the western tip of the island. Carlson's troops took Mula and then went back to the marine lines, their task completed for the Marines. The long slugging match was nearly over on December 9th. General Vandergrift was relieved of command of the Guadalcanal forces, replaced by Army Major General Alexander Patch, because as Adalhai saw the army would be taking over the fighting on Guadalcanal shortly afterwards, the Marines began to move out. The Japanese plans for evacuation were settled at high-level conferences, first in Tokyo, and then in Rabaul. General Hitashi Imamura of the East area. Army came down from Java to take charge Admiral Yamamoto's staff. General Patch was waiting for reinforcements, so he concentrated on smoothing out the American perimeter and lopping off any Japanese intrusions, such as that at Point Cruz, a hangover from the early days of the campaign. Occasionally the Japanese made a successful raid, as on one December night when a party got through the lines onto Henderson Field and wrecked a plane and a truck. At the end of December, General Patch ordered an advance against the Japanese on Mount Austin, overlooking Henderson Field. As was so often the case, American intelligence underestimated the number of enemy troops there, or their strength in arms, and paid a heavy price for a frontal assault. Colonel Okar, the Japanese area commander, was there with 2 infantry battalions and a regiment of mountain artillery. There were 500 men manning a line of pillboxes against the American advance. It took frontal attacks by the 132nd Regiment plus fire support from destroyers, and a heavy concentration of Army artillery fire to take the strong point in January. General Patch's command was reorganized as the 24th Corps. It included the 25th Army Division and the 2nd Marine Division. The Americans had 50,000 men on the island. The Japanese position was hopeless. Unit after unit was cut off. And instead of surrendering, most of those troops elected to make one last brave charge in the name of their emperor, with the full knowledge that they would be killed. The whole Guadalcanal operation became a Japanese army problem with the Navy, concerning itself only with the actual evacuation that was planned. General Hitoshi Imamura was in charge, as head of the East Area Army with his diminishing resources. Admiral Yamamoto attempted to halt the growing strength of the Americans at Guadalcanal. The supply of twin-engine Betty bombers was very short, so he used Konishi flying boats, which were even larger and more ungainly, as ATT attack craft than the American PB. The bombs they carried were too small, and the pilot training was too slight for them to have much effect writing of it later. Admiral Morrison, the Navy's historian, termed the attempt stupid and ineffective, which seems a bit harsh under the circumstances. On January 10th, General Patch had all the troops he felt he needed, and he began the drive to destroy the Japanese army presence on Guadalcanal. No one in the American organization knew how many Japanese were on the island. Japanese records show that 31,500 men of the Army and Navy had been landed on the island by January, but even the Japanese could not say how many were still alive by January 10th, for men died every day of starvation and disease. These losses were far more serious than those inflicted in combat, and among those left alive, many were so weak that their performance in battle was brief and ineffectual. They fought bravely inflicted casualties and died the heroic deaths they sought. The futility of it is apparent nearly 4 decades later, but at the time General Imamura's approach was to rescue as many men as possible so that they might fight again from other Solomon Islands and recapture Guadalcanal for a week in mid-January. Colonel S. force held out on the height called Gefu by the Japanese. A few soldiers responded to pleas that they surrender, but the majority refused. One platoon talked the matter over, and the men decided they were too weak even to surrender, so they waited for death, and it came to them in the form of a heavy shelling by big American guns. The American attack was so well coordinated that no Japanese on the island could fail to realize what was happening. American planes dominated the skies, and occasionally a Japanese Zero or a bomber came over, but almost invariably it would be shot down. American ships dominated the seas day and night, and if there were not many warships around, it was because they were not needed and were employed elsewhere. The American artillery dominated the land battle, and the American tanks, trucks, and jeeps made the going easier than it had been before, although in the jungle they still had to depend on airdrops. And Melanesian carriers for supply. The Japanese fought what must be credited as a brilliant rearguard action, considering the state of their supply and the daily bombardment from the air, and from a force of destroyers operating out of the Tagi area, the destroyers Nicholas O'Bannon, Radford, and De Haven were assigned to bombard enemy positions, and did so often putting out 1,000 rounds of 5 in ammunition per day against selected targets. The effect was devastating. The Americans drove the Japanese along the coast from the central Japanese position at Samona, west of Point Cruz. The American engineers built roads as they went, which solved the later problems of supply. There were so many troops involved that large flanking operations were the rule, but the Americans had to fight for every foot of the ground they reached the Boni River below Tassafaronga, which had been the central point of Japanese resupply. The 600 troops of the covering force made a stand here, covering General Haki's rear, as he prepared to evacuate the survivors. The 13,000 survivors by this time were a motley group. There were a few men left from the original Guadalcanal garrison and the pioneer forces that had built the airfield. There were men from the 2nd Army Division, and a handful of Colonel Eli's troops and General Kawaguchi reinforcements there were men from the 38th Division flyers from the 11th Air Fleet who had been shot down and parachuted into Guadalcanal or the sea, and sailors who had escaped their sinking ships. Admiral Yamamoto and General Imamura wanted them back, and were prepared to make heroic gestures to get them. By the end of January, Guadalcanal was so secure in American eyes that when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox came to the South Pacific, he was brought to the island by Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Holly. Guadalcanal, once the desperate worry of even President Roosevelt, was something of a showplace. Although not yet secured from the American viewpoint, the Pacific offensive had begun late in January. Admiral Holly's naval action moved up to the new Georgia area, bombarding the Japanese at points where they were constructing air bases. The Japanese tried to stop these raids by counter-raids conducted by the 11th Air Fleet, but the fleet's strength these days was no match for the combined United States Army Navy and Marine Aviation from Admiral Holly's command and General MacArthur. At the end of the month, Admiral Kusaka sent several groups of Betty bombers and Zero fighters to Guadalcanal Times, had changed the new pilots on one raid, failed to find Henderson Field. The next raid that came over was costly to the 11th Air Fleet. The Americans sent up the F-4Fs and shot down a dozen Zeros at the price of 4 American planes. The ratio was typical of the new Japanese problem. There were too many American planes in the sky and too many American ships in the sea since January 14th. Admiral Yamamoto had not even tried to resupply the troops on Guadalcanal. Air and sea strength to be committed at Guadalcanal was being saved for the evacuation effort in the 3rd week of January. Admiral Holly's intelligence reports indicated a Japanese build-up in the rest of the Solomon Islands. The effort did not seem so much aimed at retaking Guadalcanal as moving the scene of battle elsewhere under conditions more advantageous to the Japanese. One report said the Japanese were looking to invade Canton Island and to establish even more powerful bases in the southern Solomons. The intensified air activity from the 11th Air Fleet after weeks of quiet indicated the same thing. At this point, Admiral Holly could put forward 5 task forces, 1 battleships and destroyers, 1 of light cruisers, and destroyers 2 of aircraft carriers that included cruisers and destroyers, and 1 of heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and something new for the South Pacific Air Force Operations Auxiliary, or Jeep carriers. These had begun coming off the ways in large numbers to meet the submarine threat in the Atlantic and to augment the growing American carrier forces. Finally, Admiral Fitt's land-based air force had doubled in size. Each of these types of task force was capable of meeting different sorts of Japanese threats. Task Force 18, which was the cruiser and jeep carrier force set out in response to those last Japanese air raids attempted against Henderson Field. During the previous weeks, Admiral Nimitz had conferred with Holly about American plans and assessment of Japanese moves. Nimitz thought the Japanese might well be making a new attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal. He was concerned about the Japanese submarines that still operated freely in the whole area. The intelligence estimates were correct. In one sense, the enemy had made big plans concerning Guadalcanal, but so complete was the Japanese upper echelon secrecy that the Americans had no clue to the real situation that General Imamura and Admiral Yamamoto were planning the total evacuation of Guadalcanal pending that move. Admiral Yamamoto was keeping his ships at TR and Rabaul rather than expending the precious fuel that had in the past few weeks become a critical factor in the naval war. Admiral Yamamoto had foreseen this problem since the beginning of the war. He had been unable to strike that decisive victory that would send the Americans to the conference table, and now Japan was beginning to feel the might that the American economy could bring to bear. The staggering production of ships and planes and the transportation resources to move hundreds of thousands of fighting men to the fronts back in Washington. Admiral King was growing increasingly restless with the delay in securing Guadalcanal. The rest of the 25th Army Division was to move into Guadalcanal, and the 2nd Marine Division and the 8th Marine Regiment were to come out. The troops would be transferred in 4 big troop transports, and they would be protected by all those task forces that Admiral Hai had at hand. Hai was hoping that Admiral Yamamoto would send out the combined fleet to contest the change over at Guadalcanal, and this time he was ready for it. Rear Admiral Robert C. G. Finn was the commander of the cruiser task force. It consisted of 3 heavy cruisers, the White Chicago and Louisville, 3 light cruisers, the Montpelier, Cleveland, and Columbia, and 8 destroyers. The new addition, the auxiliary carriers, consisted of the Shenango with 11 fighters and 9 bombers, and the Swanee carrying 18 fighters and 15 torpedo bombers. And, from the beginning, the American force was badly managed. The jeep carriers were new to most of the battleship admirals, and Admiral Guin regarded his aircraft defences as more nuisance than assistance. The trouble was that these carriers could only travel at 18 knots, which held back the fast cruisers. Later, the surface ship commanders would learn to use auxiliary carriers by sending them out in front, where they slow speed and manoeuvres back and forth to find the face of the wind for launching planes would not distress the task force. But Admiral G. Finn had no experience in these matters, so the whole force slowed to accommodate the carriers, and the ship commanders grumbled on the evening of January 27th. The task force left F8 Island to move toward Guadalcanal with the transports. The ships steamed northwest, conducting training exercises as they went. The Witcher had just come from North Africa with the 2 auxiliary carriers, and neither Admiral G. Finn nor his crew were familiar with the South Pacific or with the Japanese way of conducting warfare. Admiral Holly had told Admiral G. Finn that he was to meet that division of destroyers operating off Guadalcanal at a point southwest of the island on the night of January 30th on January 29th. The navigator pointed out that unless something changed, they would never make it. Those carriers were holding back the whole task force, so Admiral G. Finn left the 2 auxiliary carriers in the company of a pair of destroyers and steamed on without his built-in air cover during the afternoon of January 29th. The radar operators of the task force were thoroughly confused by many blips that appeared on their screens, but some of them were proved to be friendly, craft identification. Friend or foe units were not working properly at 2. In the afternoon, the carrier Chenango was ordered to launch planes to chase away or shoot down shadowing enemy planes. 5 minutes later, the Chenango launched fighters and bombers for combat air control and carrier protection. 2 of the bombers were equipped with the newest plane radar, and the Swanee launched 4 fighters and 3 bombers as combat air patrol over the cruisers and over the anti-submarine planes. All planes were landed before nightfall, so as darkness fell over the cruiser force on the night of January 29th. There was no air cover, nor was any requested from Henderson Field. The Japanese had not been asleep. Many of the planes that snooped the cruisers that afternoon were Japanese. So in the middle of the afternoon, Admiral Kusaka ordered an airstrike of Betty bombers to be made after dark. Admiral Guillen was a careful commander. He ordered complete radio silence, which prevented the Japanese from monitoring his radio frequencies and using the transmissions to find the ships. It was an excellent tactic for the war that ended in 1918, for the War of January 1943. It was less than optimal since the Japanese planes had been shadowing the cruisers all afternoon, and the Japanese submarines in the area had been reporting on their positions. The real effect of Admiral Giffin's radio silence was to prevent the task force from sending planes to check on the blips that came up on the radar screen at the 11th Air Fleet bases in Rabaul and at Bukhar. 31 twin-engine bombers took off. The Japanese had been working on a new attack technique to strike just after darkness fell, when the enemy would be hampered by poor visibility. The Americans were totally unprepared for such an attack. As usual, the ships had all gone to general quarters at sundown, but once that ended, they had decreased their vigilance. The cruisers were 50 miles north of Reinl Island, very close to the point where they were supposed to meet the extra destroyers. They were travelling in 2 columns half an hour after sunset. The bombers arrived in the area. Admiral Giffin's radar sets showed them 60 miles to the west. Still, he did not prepare for an attack, and the task force steamed along, relaxing for the night. The Japanese torpedo bombers circled around, so they would not be silhouetted against the pink light of the last of the day in the western sky. Then they split into 2 groups to attack both columns from the dark side. The first attackers came in, and 1 torpedo bomber launched a torpedo against the destroyer Waller, but it missed. The pilots zoomed in low and strafed the destroyer and the cruiser Whiter, and then pulled up in a climbing turn. Another plane attacked the Louisville, and her captain avoided torpedoing by a sharp turn to port. It seemed that the attack was over, particularly after the anti-aircraft guns shot down a low, zooming plane that had strafed Admiral Giffin did not falter. He did not even zigzag, but moved straight on toward his rendezvous. The torpedo bombers came in again, now that they had found their quarry, and the darkness was almost complete. First, several planes flew over the formation of ships, dropping flares that lit them brightly. Red and green float flares drifted to the surface and outlined into the course of the ships. The flares became targets for the ship's gunners, who now kept their eyes on the water, not in the air. A few moments later, the Japanese bombers came in again. 1 dropped a torpedo, which hit the Louisville. This was one of the few times so far in the war that a Japanese torpedo did not detonate, that indicated the state of training of the pilot. He had dropped too soon, and the torpedo had not had time to arm itself. The anti-aircraft guns barked, but the Japanese continued to harry, the formation attacking the Chicago, the other cruisers and the destroyers. The anti-aircraft gunners fired accurately and brought down several planes. 1 blew up astern of the Waller, and another hit so close to the Chicago, that her decks were blackened by burning aviation gas. The light from the two planes was better than any flare, and in that light another torpedo plane came down and put a fish into the side of the Chicago, then a second torpedo hit, and at 8 o'clock the attack was over. The other ships had been scarred, but the Chicago had suffered serious wounds. She was taken in two by the Louisville and headed back for Espiritus. Santo Admiral Giffin's concern for punctuality at the rendezvous point seemed unimportant. Now during the night the task force was vigilant, and a Black Cat night fighter came from Asirit to Santo to hover in the morning. The two jeep carriers put up combat air patrol, but the Japanese continued their watching, and dawn found more Japanese planes in the area. The task force split up that morning, with the undamaged cruisers going back to F8, and the Chicago tow changed over to the tug Navajo, which had come out for the task. Chicago was screened by 6 destroyers, but no one thought about air cover. The combat air patrols circled around the ships as they travelled at 4 knots, but did not watch for the enemy further out. Just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Japanese struck the Chicago again, when she was just 40 miles from the big carrier Enterprise. They were after the carrier, but the combat air patrol of the Enterprise was alert, and there were too many planes for comfort, so the Japanese bombers decided to strike the crippled ship instead. Sneaking through cloud cover, they approached the Chicago before the fighter patrol from the Enterprise found them, and 9 Betty bombers launched torpedoes against the slow convoy. 4 torpedoes smashed into the Chicago side. 1 other struck the destroyer. Lavalette. Soon the Ago sank in 12,000 feet of water. Although most of her crew were saved, the Lavalette was damaged, but she could be towed to safety, and most of the Japanese bombers were shot down, but they had won another encounter with the American Navy, and had shown their perfection of 2 techniques of torpedo attack that were to be used again and again in the months to come. When Holly had the facts of the encounter, he was extremely angry at the ineptness of his cruiser commander. Once again, the American lack of experience was showing. There was, however, one bright spot: the American transports delivering the Army troops and collecting the Marines from Guadalcanal were forgotten by the Japanese in their excitement at attacking the naval vessels, so the transports landed and embarked again without any trouble at all. In January, General Patch conducted a number of operations against the Japanese, further diminishing General Huat-Tak's fighting strength. But by this time, fighting was not the primary mission of the Japanese army on Guadalcanal. Survival was the following poem, by one of the survivors of the Japanese force, indicates the state to which they were reduced by the end of 1942. No matter how far we walk, we don't know where we're going, trudging along under dark jungle growth. When will this march end? Hide during the day, move at night deep in the lush Guadalcanal jungle, our rice is gone, eating roots and grass along the ridges and cliffs, leaves hiding the trail, we lose our way, stumble and get up covered with mud. From our falls blood oozes from our wounds, no cloth to bind our cuts. Flies swarm to the scabs, no strength to brush them away, fall down and cannot move. How many times I've thought of self-termination. At the end of January, the commander of the United States 24th Corps decided that it was time to begin mopping up the enemy, and he sent a battalion of the 132nd Infantry Regiment to the southwest coast of the island. The major purpose of this operation was to stop the reinforcement of the Japanese troops west of Cape Esperance. So little was known of Japanese activity that General Patch was not sure how many enemy supply missions had been made since he came to the island. In December, the Americans moved from the Lunga area in 5 landing ship tanks, protected by 4 destroyers, and many planes from the Cactus Air Force. This activity was noted by the Japanese on the island, who feared that their K operation had been unearthed by the enemy, and the word went to Rabaul, where Admiral Kusaka strained his resources to mount a counterstrike. Half the troops had been unloaded, and 3 landing ship tanks and 2 destroyers were taking the land NG craft back to the American side of the island when the Rabaul were waiting at Guadalcanal for the next evacuation. Convoy many were moved by barge from the tip of the island to the Russell Islands, but the coast watchers and the American observation planes that saw the shuttling of the barges were unable to differentiate between empty and loaded boats. The impression grew that troops were being moved in for a new offensive. Consequently, Admiral Holly prepared for another major naval action and moved his two carrier task forces closer to Guadalcanal. Admiral Mark Mitcher had replaced Admiral Fitt as commander of the land-based air forces, and he was warned to be prepared for a major assault. General MacArthur was requested to hit Rabaul, and the Northern Solomon S. Hard A with his B-7S. Every American effort was devoted to watchful waiting for the new three-pronged Japanese attack that would subject Henderson Field to another siege. On February 3rd, the Japanese evacuation force massed again at Buan. For some reason, neither the air searchers nor the coast watchers paid much attention as the single cruiser and 20 destroyers headed for Guadalcanal. There was, as always these days, the air gauntlet to be run, but Admiral Kusaka was proving that in desperate circumstances he could provide adequate air support, and the 65 American planes that appeared in the sky were met by even more zeros. The smoke trails of falling aircraft resembled fireworks in an amusement park on the 4th of July. But the Japanese air cover achieved what it set out to do, although at high cost all the destroyers got through. Although the Shiranui and the Mazi were damaged that night, the PT boats did not come out in force. They had been too badly mauled by the Japanese destroyers 2 nights earlier. The American fighters and bombers tried to mount an assault, but night fighting was still not their strong point, and the Japanese had planes over Henderson Field all night long, dropping flares, bombing and strafing to keep the Cactus Air Force down. In the morning the ships were gone this time, carrying 4,000 men to safety. The Japanese took a different route to their base this time, and the morning search of Cactus Air Force bombers did not find them. The searchers did note about 3 dozen empty landing barges floating in the water off Cape Esperance, and they so reported when they landed, but the message never got to an intelligence officer who might be considering the Japanese overall strategy, and no one put 2 and 2 together. As of February 5th, the Americans were still waiting for the other shoe to drop for Admiral Yamamoto to launch a new strike by the combined fleet. The air power that the enemy had assembled for this period was impressive, and gave further credence to the idea that an attack was in the offing. On February 6th, Admiral Yamamoto launched the final rescue mission, and it was the easiest of all, for the weather seriously hampered the American airstrikes. The bombers damaged the destroyers Isok Kazi and Hamaki, but not enough to turn them back from the mission that night. The 18 destroyers rescued the last 1,800 men on Guadalcanal, and 2 other destroyers picked up the survivors who had moved to the Russell Islands, even on the morning of February 8th. The Americans still had no inkling of the plan that the Japanese had devised, attempted and completed, with virtually no losses of ships or men. There had been heavy losses in aircraft on both sides, but that was the price that had to be paid. The Americans were ready to strike hard on the morning of February 8th. They reached the Cape Esperon beaches, ready for a desperate battle, and found only empty quarters, vacated campfires, abandoned supplies, and empty landing boats drifting in the water offshore. They finally got the idea the Japanese, at least in this area of the island, were gone. That day the American troops moved forward, still cautiously, waiting for the snap of rifles and the popping of machine guns. But these sounds were not heard at 4:30 a.m. in the afternoon on the Tan River. One finger of the pincers they had planned met the other, without having seen a Japanese soldier all day long. Then it was conclusive. General Patch sent a message to Admiral Holly announcing the total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, and it was bravado and exaggeration, but it was true. Nonetheless, Admiral Yamamoto and General Imamura had combined forces to carry out one of the most remarkable military movements in the history of warfare, and yet it was still defeat the Japanese had occupied. Guadalcanal, in order to advance their striking power against Australia and the United States. For the first time, the Americans had struck back not in a desperate defensive action, as Midway was, but in a genuine offensive. In the beginning, the American effort had been slipshod, and it very nearly failed from inadequate resources and inadequate military command. But as the weeks, not months, but weeks rolled on, the Americans seemed to catch on more each day. The magnificent effort of the pilots of the Cactus Air Force in the first 3 months saved the island, in spite of the bad judgment of the senior commanders. With the coming of Holly, defeatism and conservatism were replaced with a fighting spirit, and from that point onward the course of the battle changed quickly in the air. The Americans won the battle on two levels, and first was that the original band of pilots performed as valiantly as any men in the air ever had during a period as desperate as the Battle of Britain, that takes nothing away from the bravery of the Japanese, who for the first half of the battle suffered from a 1,000 m round trip in order to fight in the second half of the battle, when the Japanese had bases closer to Guadalcanal. The Americans were bringing in more and more planes, while the pipeline from Japan was slowly shrinking on the ground. The Americans and Japanese were about even in numbers after that first period in which the Americans missed their chance to take over the whole island. But if they had taken it just then without supply, perhaps General Vandergrift could not have held it. The Marines performed brilliantly at Bloody Ridge, and again in the second major assault against Henderson Field, the Japanese, hampered after October by ever more serious shortages of supplies, could do nothing but wait for reinforcement, and they waited successfully. But they left 24,000 men dead on that island, as compared to the American loss of about 3,000 on the sea. The battles of Guadalcanal, for the most part, showed a superiority of naval performance by the Japanese. The Americans were hurt by the poor quality of their torpedoes, and by the poor quality of their training destroyers played a crucial role in the Japanese victories. The performance of the Japanese destroyer men was no less than brilliant. They were led by Admiral Rao Tanaka, whose abilities were better appreciated by Admiral Nimitz than they were by Admiral Yamamoto, and the Imperial General Staff Admiral Tanaka had one failing from the Japanese point of view. He spoke his mind directly on the problem of resupplying the Japanese forces on Guadalcanal, and he had the misfortune to be precisely right about a serious blunder in policy from the South Pacific. He was transferred first to Singapore and then to Burma, where he spent the rest of the war in desk jobs in terms of ships lost. The numbers were precisely the same, 24 Japanese ships and 24 American. The Americans lost 2 carriers, but the Japanese lost 2 battleships, and so it all evened out in terms of tactical success. But in a strategic sense, Guadalcanal was a disaster for the Japanese Navy. The Americans could afford to lose those ships. The United States was already engaged in a massive shipbuilding program that Japan could not hope to match. Above all, however, Guadalcanal was the beginning of the confirmation of Admiral Yamamoto's prediction that the tide would turn. There would be more months of false hopes in Tokyo, in Rabaul, and in true Admiral Yamamoto would fall a victim to his arch-enemy Admiral Nimitz a few months after the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Nimitz's radio intelligence operators would learn of Admiral Yamamoto's coming visit to Rabaul by plane, and would be presented with an itinerary. They would take the intelligence to Admiral Nimitz and suggest that Yamamoto be assassinated by an American air ambush. P. Nimitz would approve, and it would be done. A flight of P-38 fighter planes would intercept Yamamoto's 2 Betty bombers out of Rabaul, and he would be shot down and die in the wreck. Japan and the Imperial Navy would never quite recover from the shock of it, but it would be just a reflection of what was happening to Japan in the war. The American juggernaut was able, in the fall of 1942, to turn its productive capacity to the Pacific, the North African campaign having been launched successfully, and that change above all others coming at the time of the desperate struggle for Guadalcanal constituted the turning of the tide.